fruit made its mark on the New World. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at apples and how they were both meat and drink to the 17th century colonists, how they came to America in the first place, and why your apple today is not like the apple of yesterday. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first question to tackle is crab apples. All the sources say there were native crab apples in North America, but no apples. But is a crab apple just an apple? Crabapple trees are regularly planted near garden apple trees to pollinate them. Since apples are dioecious, that is, they mostly cannot self-pollinate. And the seeds of apple/crabapple hybrids grow into fertile trees. The flowers have the same structure, and except for the size, most crab apples look like apples. They aren't poisonous or anything, though most crab apples would be considered inedible, which means many of the rules of the same species or different species I learned in school about animals seem to be scrambled here. So are crab apples apples or not? The answer is they are, sort of. It depends on where you draw the line. First, the rules for plant speciation are a bit different than they are in animals, so I'm just dropping that off at the door. Then there's the fact that apples are extreme heterozygotes. More on that later. So line drawing has definitely happened to separate purposefully cultivated lines, Malus domestica, from the wild, freewheeling, outcrossing Malus, everything else. So really, it has more to do with just practical definitions, agreed upon conventions, and most importantly, giving botanists something they can all agree on to keep the confusion down to a dull roar. All the apples, crab and not, have the same round shape. Some are taller, some are squatter, some are top-heavy. A stem, which can be short and woody, or longer and look more like a cherry stem. They all have a blossom end with 5 points, matching with the 5-sectioned ovary of the apple/crabapple blossom. The seeds in the core look the same, merely differing by size, and at ripeness they all have a white or off-white crunchy flesh that is covered by a generally smooth skin that ranges from yellow to green into reds, often covering a range of all of those colors. So for colonial purposes, the crab apples that were present on their arrival were recognizable and useful as crab apples, but not as apples. So the verdict is there were no native apples in North America. By general agreement, all the Malus genus that produce fruits under 2 inches in diameter and generally have a bitter or not pleasant taste while raw are considered crab apples. The larger sort, even if not good for eating out of hand at picking time, are considered apples, especially if they have been selected and cultivated by people. Sort of like with the last episode in Piggies, the wild boar and the farmyard pig are all just swine, and one can be interbred with the other, and what is a good farm pig is different from what a good wild pig is. But anyone looking at a domestic pig and a wild boar would say, oh yeah, those are definitely 2 different animals. It's the same with apples. What humans want in an apple is usually different from what the tree, looking to live long and prosper and spread widely, wants in a tree. And the apple's version of that has worked really well, because despite starting in the southeast corner of Kazakhstan, apples have managed to ring the globe in the temperate zone of the northern hemisphere, Asia, Europe, and North America. Once humans got involved, apples laid claim to the southern hemisphere and Australia, New Zealand, South America, and even Africa. There are plenty of smaller sweet apples along with large bitter apples. In fact, there are thousands of varieties of apples just hanging out all over the world at any time. And like many other plants, they are ready to just mix and match some more. Some plants are better at randomizing which genes are expressed, which combinations are expressed, and whether genes are expressed in multiples. Apples are one of those plants and are called extreme heterozygotes. That means when the incomplete cells from the 2 parents come together in sexual reproduction, the mixing and matching of what genes are included, what genes are expressed, what genes are active is just much more extremely randomized than in most organisms. Lots of other plants have pretty high heterozygosity, like pears, stone fruits, peaches, plums, apricots, and our old friend corn, where hand pollination was and is used to ensure the varieties are preserved. But apples are special. Even with extremely controlled pollination, the apples produced by a tree, grown from the seed of two very desirable parents, the offspring, can be unrecognizable. But the good, plump, sweet, and tart apples were cultivated, improved, grafted, and spread about by people, and were designated apples. The small, hard, tannically bitter apples that were left to reproduce and spread through their own devices were designated as crab apples. And when you grew trees from seed, you just never knew if the seeds would produce one or the other. Crab apples will almost always, without fail, produce crab apples, though occasionally a more apple-like sport, and a sport is a genetic anomaly phenotype that feels like it appears kind of out of nowhere, that might appear. But apples, sweet, tart, creamy, or cider types cannot be depended on to keep producing the same sort of apple from their seeds. And that was the trick everyone wanted to master. As we'll see in just a little bit, both apples and crab apples have their uses, but it's mostly the apples that most people wanted to bother with. Crab apples were mainly fussed about with when the apples ran out. As a way to keep increasing the store of tasty apples and to reduce the need to fuss about with crab apples, the world came up with a way to trick apples into always growing what we humans wanted, and that was grafting. Grafting is the practice of growing an apple tree from just any old apple seed, and then attaching a branch of the desired apple tree to that rootstock, and growing a whole new tree that way. The roots from one tree and the branches and the fruit from another. Grafting has been practiced for at least 3,000 years. The earliest records are from China. Records of grafting show up just about everywhere fruit tree cultivation was recorded. Ancient Greece, Japan, Persia, and Rome. Both the Roman, Persian, and Islamic empires spread the technology all around the Mediterranean, Europe, and Central Asia. So by the time we get to 16th and 17th century England, grafting apple trees to get the apples people wanted was a generally known and widely practiced technology. One that farmers knew, but once again our early city people and non-farmer colonists likely did not. So the earliest colonists came over with apple seeds and grew a hodgepodge of apples. Those apples likely got hodgepodgier as they made new hybrids with each other and the native crab apples. But over time, some good varieties emerged, and the skilled farmers arrived, and grafting finally came to the New World. And the wide open spaces and serially cleared land of the new colonists were extremely hospitable to apple trees. Other fruit trees as well. The Spanish had brought peaches in the 16th century, and those were so widely spread across the U.S., from, say, Florida to the Carolinas and west to about Missouri, that early explorers assumed peaches were actually a New World crop, along with things like plums, which actually are. Cherries, pears, pomegranates, and apricots would also come over, but nothing spread so widely, needed less care, and was more tolerant of a wider range of weathers than the apple. While cereal grains got off to a rocky start, apples faced no such obstacles. Apples became a mainstay of English colonial food and drink. In England, as much of the other world, apples and many other tree crops were mainly grown in areas where no grain could be grown, on hillsides and on ground that was too unstable for plowing or too arid, especially at the surface, for annual crops. This was partly true in the New World, but orchards were also grown in places with excellent soil, where a low-effort crop was desired, like in the Chesapeake, when time and cultivation energy were focused most specifically on tobacco. A low-maintenance crop like apples could provide calories and later profits in a way that wouldn't overly interfere with the demands of the tobacco crop. And as a clearly non-native tree that produced a farmyard fruit that was used extensively in English-style cooking, the long-lived apple tree was a way of proclaiming land claimed. The planting of an orchard would be a clear symbol that civilization had arrived here. And this habit of using fruit trees generally, and the apple tree specifically, to mark the claiming of land with a civilized presence would continue to be a theme as the new nation expanded its western borders. For not only was the planting of the tree a way of claiming cultivation and civilization, the work surrounding the fruit harvest was repeatedly used as a signal of virtue. Leaving the apples to fall and rot on the ground was waste and sloth, but displaying the products of all the housewifely tasks of picking, sorting, and preserving were ways hard work could separate a household as good English folk and not wild, houseless savages, or possibly worse, layabout folks of the lower sort who did not engage in the wholesome efforts of food preservation. Bringing an apple to a schoolmaster or a tutor in the fall was something anyone could do. But bringing an apple out of season, from the cellar of your house, preserved in barrels and kept sound, that was a way to show off the virtue your family had accrued through work. It was without irony that the apple went from a biblical symbol of deceit and vice to one of order and virtue on the British colonial shores. In the 17th century, apples were eaten just about every which way except fresh. Certainly some might have been eaten while the work of picking and packing took place, but as I've mentioned before, Northern Europeans in the 17th century still had grave suspicions of raw vegetable matter of any kind, and the propensity of raw cut apples to brown so quickly, practically in front of their eyes, couldn't have done much to reassure people of the stability or healthiness of the unprocessed fruit, especially combined with the messy digestive issues which commonly resulted from small children eating themselves silly on raw fruit. So dried, cooked, and juiced were the preferred ways to consume apples in the 17th century British colonies. The majority of 17th century apples mostly tended to be tart, sour, or bitter, and give your tongue sort of a desiccated flannelly feel. This is the levels of malic acid and tannins, incidentally what causes apples to turn brown, were usually higher in these apples than they were in the modern apples we currently eat out of hand, and the sugar levels were often lower. The few sweet types where sugars were higher and the acids and tannins were lower, what we think of when we think of an apple, were termed dessert apples and set aside in a category of their own. The common higher acid and higher tannin apples were processed to make them more palatable in ways that concentrated the sugars and manipulated the acids and tannins. First, let's look at drying. The typical method was to peel and sometimes core apples, slice them and sew them onto strings. Communities would even get together for an apple peeling bee, bringing all the apples and people together to add some sociability to otherwise repetitive tasks that were not mentally engaging. Incidentally, the biblical symbolism of the apple as a party to temptation and fleshly knowledge was not lost on people, young or old, participating in these apple peeling bees. These and similar events were often important courtship opportunities. But back to the fruits. The resulting strings of apples would be hung from rafters in homes to dry along with the beans and herbs of earlier episodes. Water leaving the apple flesh would concentrate both the sweet and tart flavors in the apple and make it more resistant to rot. Their final leathery, spongy consistency was not only relatively low in water, but would also be higher in sugar, acid, and tannins are also used to tan or preserve leather, and the resulting ratios of these chemical compounds was very unfriendly to bacteria. Hanging suspended from the rafters would do the job of protecting the apples from four-legged marauders. The dried apples would be dropped into stews and pottages to add flavor and bulk through the following winter and spring. This tendency for good keeping also meant that dried apple usually had a big role in winter mincemeats, the pie filling that was initially used as a way to mix meat scraps, fat, spices, and a variety of dried fruits into a festive and long-keeping tasty treat. A lacing of the mince with distilled liquors like whiskey or brandy also increased the keeping time of the mixture, as well as its festive spirit. When meat was short and apples were not, apples would often stand in for the meat. Early meatless mincemeats were often called mock mincemeat. However, as the Anglo-American palate fell away from its medieval preferences for mixtures of fruits, meats, and spices all tangled up together in dishes, meatless mincemeats actually became the preferred version. And even more so in the New World, where meats were more common and sweets were less so. That means now mincemeats in the U.S. are typically all fruit, which caused no end of confusion to me as a little kid. Second, there's the cooking down of apples, which is another way to concentrate the sugars and get more flavor from this relatively watery fruit. The first stage of the process would be an apple sauce, which was a typical accompaniment for meats. But the lack of refrigeration meant that regular applesauce was not the destination for most of the stewed apples. Because they contain a fairly large amount of pectin, which is a gelling agent, apples were typically cooked down into apple butter, which is just a highly concentrated applesauce, and then apple cheese, which is an even more concentrated apple butter, that was then squeezed into cakes and left to dry a bit further. My point from last week that cheese was more of a description of being solid and sliceable and not initially being about dairy comes through again with apples. And butter also started as a descriptor for many things of similar texture, sort of viscous and spreadable. As a side note, I find it interesting that butter has regained its position as a descriptor, especially over the last few decades, but this time around, cheese has not. Again, in these processes, water was driven out, which bacteria require to operate, and the resulting spread or compressed cake had very high concentrations of both sugar and acid in what little moisture remained. The resulting sweet, tart spread of apple butter or slices of apple cheese would go well with things like cornmeal mush, breads, cheeses, or the plain boiled meats. Apple butter is easy to make, but it's time-consuming. You can make it and you can find it, usually seasonally, in a grocery store with a well-stocked jam section, and definitely at farmers markets and pumpkin farm stands. The modern equivalent of apple cheese is the gourmet Spanish nibble quince paste, or membrillo. Quince also has a large amount of pectin, so it happily makes this slightly rubbery, sweet, tart cheese. However, quince contain far less sugar than apples, so quince paste has always been made with sugar, while apple cheese typically was not. Since quince paste has a far more complex and elusive flavor, it's stuck around despite all the time and trouble it requires, while apple cheese was just another way to preserve apples. So it mostly has not, losing out to things like, apple chips. But if you feel like I've missed apple pies, that's because at this point, fruit-only pies were not much of a thing in the 17th century colonies. There's the wheat problem, of course, but until sugar was regularly available, dessert, and thus apples or any other fruit on their own, was not something people considered making pies out of in the 17th century British Atlantic colonies, along with the jams, jellies, and marmalades, which will begin to appear in earnest in the 18th century. The last way apples for eating were typically stored was in barrels. The apples destined for the longest storing would usually be layered with straw, the waste from harvested grain. This would allow for more air circulation and prevent both rot and the spread of rot. There's that poorly understood proverb that gets overused and used incorrectly. The one bad apple spoils the whole barrel. Well, the sentiment is essentially correct. The way it is applied is just off. Currently, the implied meaning seems to be, and if we just pluck out the rotten apple, the rest of the barrel will be fine. Move along. but any sensible 17th century householder storing apples would know all the removal of a few very rotten apples does is make room for more rotten apples. Nothing's been solved. The finding of a rotten apple, yes, is cause to remove said apple and feed it to the pigs or whatever. But then the whole barrel needs to be emptied and sorted, and the barrel itself needs to be cleaned. Until the whole apple barrel is dealt with, all you have is a barrel that will keep making more and more rotten apples. Again, these people had no germ theory, and granted their ideas of how or why the rot started may have been off base, but everyone knew rot passed through proximity and contact. So the apples around the rotten one, even if not yet showing obvious outward signs of rot, were likely infected. So they were slated for immediate processing into sauce or pudding or butter or something to be eaten or preserved. Sure, one bad apple can take the whole barrel down, but it was the foolish householder that ever thought simply getting rid of the obviously rotten apples solved the problem. Now, barreling apples wasn't just about not wanting to spend forever making apple preserves. There's also the fact that when whole apples age, they get sweeter. The malic acid, which is responsible for the sourness, and the tannin, which gives the dry tongue feeling, actually degrade and are consumed by the little apple cells puttering along inside the whole apples. Because these apples were not waxed, the pores in the apple skin would be able to open and close, releasing the byproducts of the slowly but surely metabolizing apples. The open pores in the apple skin would also mean the apples would lose water over time and become a little bit leathery and lose their crispness. This was what happened to the apples Pippin was given after he had arrived at Minas Tirith in Tolkien's The Return of the King. And those apples were described as wrinkled but sound and sweet. The change in water, acid, and tannin content over weeks and months meant that the apples, which were too tart and bitter to be enjoyable when they were just picked, often mellowed and became sweet and tasty after a rest in a barrel. Modern apples no longer go through this process as they are waxed to defend against dehydration and kept in nitrogen atmospheres that control oxygen and carbon dioxide exposure to almost stop the apple cell respiration. The respiration in aging can never completely be stopped, and if you're paying attention and you're into that kind of thing, you can definitely tell when the new crop apples have arrived and the vault apples have left the building. Apples just a few days or weeks old always have more flavor in spring than the apples several months old. All the same, the near halting of apple aging means modern apples must be sweet when they are picked, but several hundred years of breed selection and the perfection of grafting techniques have definitely seen to that. But it means most of us will never again walk into an apple cellar or apple barn and smell that mysterious apples in storage smell. It is definitely apple-y, but not overwhelming. Sometimes I think the people who create apple air fresheners or apple candles once thought that was the scent they were trying to replicate. But the apple barn smell, while cozy and lovely, is so lost from the modern smell lexicon that the smell architects have lost the plot. Now apple scent is more akin to just like a face full of green apple Jolly Ranchers. Incidentally, I am not poo-pooing modern apple vaults with their controlled temperatures and oxygenless atmospheres. They eliminate food loss to rotting and the need to periodically sort apples. So it's a trade-off that definitely keeps more people fed. Oh, and before I wrap up solid apples, I need to share just what crab apples were used for. When sugar arrives, crab apples get to do more. But in pre-sugar days, crab apples were mostly pickled. It was noticed that crab apples carried a lot of punch in the pectin department, so they were sometimes added to apple preparations like butter and cheese to help them set better. Oh, and the last fun fact, in England and the early colonies, apples were often called pippins, and the crab apples were called codlings. It's sprinkled all over the cookbooks. It's not until the end of the 18th century and firmly into the 19th century that apple and crab apple are firmly established as the words used in cookbooks and brewing manuals, which next week, I promise. Yes, apples were too big of a topic to cram into just 1 week, so that means next week I'll finally get to liquid apples, or at least the juice of apples, and the multiple roles it played in 17th century colonial food. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And more is going up on my Instagram @THOAFood if all you want is pictures. A few words to review this podcast on Podchaser or Good Pods or your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with any promised pictures or links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOAFood and in the show description.